did you agree with Mark there that really this is the concern of not just state-run businesses, but the fact that this is Chinese nationalism? This is a consumer no longer wanting to purchase Apple products.
Well, thank you for having me. Certainly a very noisy situation around Apple right now. There's no question that part of the negative inferences that are swirling around right now is this idea that Apple gets caught up in a nationalist rivalry between the U.S. And China. If iPhones, for example, were to become stigmatized throughout Chinese society over the next few months to the point that it depressed demand, those types of narratives inevitably are popping into investors' minds right now. But I think it's worth noting that so far, the ban in the government agencies, we're looking at about 500,000 units, according to a lot of the Wall Street research that I'm reading. And that's out of a total run rate over the next 12 months of about 45 million iPhones in China. So the current ban impacts a little over 1% of the units. Obviously, if it spreads to state-owned enterprises and it winds up having a bigger societal impact in China on iPhone usage, it would be much worse, much bigger. But at this point, it's fairly contained. It's also worth noting that Apple has been gaining market share in China over the last few years, about 300 basis points in the last 12 months. Now, it is true that Huawei is launching more competitive phones. So, it'll be interesting to see how that dynamic evolves. But the current context is that Apple's doing very well in China.
Its valuation is done very well as well. Do you think that basically this is a bit of a perfect storm, therefore? We're seeing this sort of market cap erosion because of how well tech companies have outperformed, because we're at a 29 times future earnings?
Yeah, I think the street's at about 650 for next year. So we're actually at 27 and change on the forward multiple right now. But there's no question that when the stock peaked at 198 a few weeks ago, it was around 30 times. It was priced to perfection. So this type of news is not going to be greeted favorably. In addition, we've got macro issues with rising rates that can also pressure equity valuation. So I think this is a healthy pullback. But in terms of the bigger question, does this change the bull case for Apple over the long term? I definitely think the jury's still out. There's probably some legitimate signal in today's news, but there's also a tremendous amount of noise.
Yes.
And overreacting to knee-jerk, noisy, media-driven things around this stock and many others, frankly, hasn't historically been a great way to make money on Wall Street.
And what's interesting is that Apple has a big event coming up pretty soon, but Apple has also been pretty dedicated to China in terms of what they've said, at least.
This is the big question for me, Alec, right? Last quarter, they said that there was a swing in China to 8% revenue growth in Greater China from a 3% decline the prior quarter. But it's what they called switchers. Consumers in China that were buying an iPhone for the first time or switching from a domestic or other international brand. I acknowledge what you just said, but look at the market reaction and explain to us whether this is knee-jerk or it's the market recalibrating what they heard from Apple in that earnings call.
I think it's a little bit of both. Obviously, it's knee-jerk because investors have to react to the news as it breaks. We can't control when we get the news, but definitely a recalibration of potential, revenue headwinds, earnings headwinds is definitely in the calculus here. But, ultimately, American investors, we're not used to gauging, government intervention of this magnitude. It's normally about the free market deciding who's got the best product. I think on that basis, it's clear Chinese people love iPhones. But obviously, when we have, the government's hand at play so heavily, it's difficult for Americans to read because, frankly, it's not something that we're used to in our home market or really in most major markets around the world. So we'll have to see how it plays out. But unless, the government takes a very heavy hand, I don't think this is going to really be looked back upon as a major negative game-changing inflection point for the company.
Alec, the question of the day here on Bloomberg Television has been, is tech in trouble? In the year of AI, the year of the Fed, and valuations, is geopolitics and China now kind of an equal-weighted risk factor?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, I don't know about equal weighted. We've got a lot of other macro issues we're contending with, but certainly geopolitical risk with China is at the top of the geopolitical risk table, and certainly, the situation with Taiwan, and now just this general competitive tension that we seem to have going on with the Chinese. The Trade Secretary's recent visit, Gina Raimondo, didn't really go over that well. So it's definitely something that investors are going to have to monitor, especially in light of the recent regulations around semiconductors, and us banning their access to certain high-end semis. They're trying to do the same to us in other areas. We've got NVIDIA involved, so it's definitely something that investors are going to have to watch.